Hi, I'm Fiery Cushman, and I study how people make what you might think of as ordinary decisions, like how to go to the grocery store and decide what you're going to buy and bring home, but also how we make moral decisions. And I'm interested in the ways in which those are similar and the ways in which they differ.
Hi, my name is Jessie Snedeker, and I study how children learn language, how we understand language as we're speaking to one another, and how we produce it. I'm a developmental psychologist and also what is called a psycholinguist, so working at the intersection of psychology and linguistics.
Hi, my name is Max Krasnow. I'm in the cognition, brain, and behavior area. My research mostly focuses on how we make social decisions. So how do we treat the social world differently than the physical world? And maybe where did those decision-making mechanisms come from over human evolution?
Hello, my name is George Alvarez, and I'm also in the psychology department in the cognition, brain, and behavior program. And I study cognitive capacity limitations, trying to understand what limits people's ability to pay attention and remember things. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Josh Green, and I'm in the Department of Psychology. I am in the social psychology area and in the cognition, brain, behavior area. I study moral decision-making, both using behavioral methods and neuroscientific methods. And these days, I'm interested in high-level cognition and decision-making more generally.
I'm Sam Gershman. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard, and I'm also affiliated with the Center for Brain Science. I have pretty broad research interests, but my main interests are in learning, memory, and decision-making. And I study that both behaviorally and using neuroimaging in humans as well as in animals.
Hi, I'm John Wise. I'm a professor in the psychology department at Harvard too, and I direct the lab for youth mental health. Our work focuses on children and adolescents who have mental health problems and what kinds of interventions can be done to help them. Most of our work involves developing interventions and then testing them, and then when they work well, we try to help disseminate them.
I'm Leah Somerville. I am a professor in the psychology department at Harvard and also affiliated with the Center for Brain Science Neuroimaging. I direct a laboratory focused on understanding the nature and relationship between brain development and psychological development throughout childhood and adolescence. And I'm also the director of our graduate program in the department. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Talia Conkle, and I'm an assistant professor also in the Department of Psychology and affiliated with the Center for Brain Science. I study high-level vision, so how we look out at the world and recognize the things in it, how we remember what we see, and I use a lot of computational approaches to try and understand that mechanism.
Hi, I'm Dan Gilbert. I'm a professor of psychology in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University. I'm a social psychologist. I study happiness. I study how people think about the future. And lately, I've gotten very interested in studying conversation.
Hi, I'm Mark Katzenbuehler. I'm a new faculty member in the psychology department. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. And our lab focuses on elucidating some of the biological, psychological, and social consequences of stigma with a particular focus on structural and systemic forms of stigma.
My name is Steve Pinker. I'm a professor in the psychology department at Harvard. I'm trained as a cognitive psychologist. I've done research on visual cognition, on language development in children, on moral and affective psychology, but I'm interested in all aspects of language, mind, and human nature, and I've written on everything from irregular verbs to the history of genocide.
Prospective students don't necessarily need to have a connection ahead of time with faculty members before deciding to apply to work with them. I do think it's valuable, though, for prospective students to reach out to faculty members ahead of time and let them know not only that they're interested in potentially working with them as a graduate student, but also why, to give them a sense of the motivation behind why you might be interested in studying with them and contributing together to research. I think as well, it can be useful to reach out to faculty members ahead of time to ask whether they might be interested in reviewing applications or potentially recommending a student for admission that next year. And there's really no way to know that unless you ask.
Although you may not need a connection with the prospective mentor is very good to do your research and learn everything you can about that person, exactly the kind of work that person does, and even research what the students who've worked with that person have done in their careers after they leave the lab, because that's going to tell you a lot about whether it's going to be a good fit for you and your goals.
You don't need to have a connection with a PI before applying, but it's certainly a good idea to try to make that connection if you can. So I do recommend reaching out to people you're interested in working with, and that can help you get information, and it can also help them, you know, be on their radar and be thinking about you as someone they might like to have in their lab.
The best kind of email that you could write to a PI, and I think I'm really just speaking for myself, so I don't want to generalize too much, but I think that the simple thing you want to ask is, are you taking students, and here's what I'm interested in doing, and here's my background. And the PI can say, you know, your interests match, but your background doesn't, or your background matches, but your interests don't, and so on, right? Yeah, so you can kind of leave that up to the PI to determine.
My interests change over time. So sometimes if somebody looks at things that I did 10 years ago, they might think, oh, I'm going to come and work with him on that, but might not be aware that that's not an active area of research in my lab today. So these are good things to ask a person, you know, when you're making that initial contact, or if you end up getting an interview.
It's possible your letter or email will come at a time when their bandwidth is low or their email inbox is giant, and a lack of response does not indicate a lack of interest. It shouldn't be taken that way. It may have just gotten lost in the fire hose of email. And so I think it's important to reach out, but also, you know, if you don't get that reply, don't interpret it the wrong way. And you may not get an answer, and that doesn't necessarily mean what you might be first inclined to think it means.
And so it's certainly the case that you should think about your research mentors and their network when you're trying to generate graduate school leads, because you learn a lot of useful things by working with people directly. Also, seeking out people at conferences, right? The year before or the fall of applications can be a good way to begin to build a relationship.
I guess this is where our program might be different than others, in that our students are guaranteed funding and the PIs don't necessarily provide funding to the students. I think there are situations in which they can supplement, but the graduate program here provides guaranteed funding in the form of a stipend and teaching assistantships, is my understanding, and that professors don't have to make their decisions based on availability of funding.
Funding is standard. Everyone who is admitted is funded. And so there's really no need to ask until the offer of admission is provided, and then you'll be told.
Sometimes students are interested in reaching out far ahead of time and thinking about the list of schools that they might want to apply to reach out to faculty to ask if they're will be reviewing applications, interested in taking students. I think most of us might have a general idea about that as early as the fall. But at least when it comes to our department, that we don't get a sort of final answer as to who will be able to recommend admitting a student until quite late in the program, even after applications are due. So asking to find out in general whether there's a likelihood of accepting students that year or reviewing applications, I think people can ask as soon as fall. If you ask earlier than that, I think it would be hard for many faculty members to give a clear answer. But then it is true that there is some ambiguity all the way up till the end, at least when it comes to our department, which might deviate from other graduate programs.
We don't have to fund students off of our grants. Many of my colleagues, folks who went to graduate school with, who ended up at different kinds of institutions, are in a position where they have to do that. And so they have to be thinking about how their grants line up with research assistant opportunities and how that fits along with someone's PhD trajectory. And so it's important to realize that coming in, that there's very different constraints placed on different faculty members.
I think it probably varies between mentors and it varies across time. I think the place to start is really asking from your own perspective, is the mentor a good fit to what you want to study?
Particularly the way I look at applicants, it's less about if their specific interests overlap with where my lab is now, or their specific interests overlap with particular questions I would be interested in asking. I look for general interests and enough flexibility to find lots of things interesting.
Personally, I have a penchant for doing new things, and I am always exhilarated if some student comes along and sweeps me off my feet and carries me to some new place that I didn't think I would ever go. So I find that exciting. Of course, it's also necessary to maintain some kind of core research program. So I'm kind of careful to make sure that I have some proportion of my lab working on kind of the bread and butter stuff that my lab does.
I guess we would all agree that we're not looking for carbon copies of ourselves. We're not trying to clone the exact, entity that we are or our lab is. So, or at least in my case, I'm looking for people whose interests are close enough to what we do that I believe we can help them develop their career in the way they would like to. But then I look for each graduate student to develop his or her own professional identity that differs from mine enough that it doesn't look like they're simply doing what I do.
This intersects really closely with one of the criteria that I apply when I'm looking at applications, and I think that many of my colleagues do as well, which is the first question I'm asking myself when I look at the application is this person trying to answer questions that I want to spend the next 5 to 10 years of my life answering? And of course, closely linked to that is the question of whether I can provide them good training for answering those kinds of questions. Is there added value to working with me if that's what you want to do? Or would you be better off elsewhere? Because I do really look upon this as a problem of fitting people together, right? Mentors together with students as opposed to just finding the best people.
A lab is a community of people. And if your interest is outside that community, they can't help you, they can't train you, and they probably won't learn much from you. So your job is to convince me that intellectually you will fit in. It's not hard to do. It's pretty easy to look on the web and see what I study and then explain why your interests fit with mine. Now, should you tell me that if they don't? No, because you shouldn't be applying to work with me if your interests don't fit with mine.
It's sort of case by case. We review and we look at the full package. All of those ingredients can play a role. In our department, the number of slots available to us is such that most of us on average will have an opportunity to work with one new student per year, and in some cases not even one. And so we're trying, I think, most of us are trying to find the one applicant who appears to have the potential to make the best use of their sources and skills in our lab.
One of the things that some people know and some people don't know when they're applying for graduate school is that the admissions process is radically different than it was when you're an undergraduate. In all of the psychology programs that I know of, there's not an admissions office. I think this is generally true. There's no admissions office that is processing your application and weighing different factors. Instead, what there is a set of faculty members, right, who are reading applications. Usually everybody in the department is reading applications. And they're going to get together to some degree or another to make admissions decisions. But this is a lot about individuals and what they look for as they are reading an application. I think we have some questions we're trying to answer. The first one is that question about whether the applicant's interests are a good fit for my interests and for my abilities. For that, I go and I look at the essay. I read the essay, I see how they're thinking about these questions. Can I get excited? Can they make me excited about the question they've identified? The second thing that I try to figure out is whether a student is in a position to make this giant commitment to joining a PhD program and probably identifying the thing they're going to do for the rest of their life. And you can be ready to do that because you've been in a lab for a couple of years and you really know what it is. You can be ready to do that because you've written a senior thesis and you've investigated this question and you're fully committed. But I'm looking for that no matter what, because so many people start out PhD programs and don't find that it's a good fit. And that's fine, it's gonna happen some of the time, but I think it saves a lot of grief along the way if I can try to figure out the answer to that question before they start. Also looking for intellectual power. And that's probably the hardest one to pin down to a particular part of the application. I'll be honest, when people have awesome GRE scores, that's usually a pretty good indicator there's gonna be intellectual power there. I don't take low GRE scores to be an indicator of the opposite. I've learned far too many times from far too many students that there are plenty of people who don't test well. In that case, I might be looking at coursework. I might be looking again back at that statement. I might be looking at what their recommenders say, or I might really want to give the interview a lot of weight as a way of testing somebody's intellectual power, how they handle questions on the fly. I'm finding myself increasingly looking for some sort of evidence of grit, gumption, ability to persist when things get difficult.
So personally, what I do is I jump straight to the research statement and I see if this person's interests jibe with mine. Is this person interested in things I'm interested in? Not necessarily that I knew I was interested in. I could be convinced by the research statement that there's something different and interesting that I want to get into. And then the next thing that I really put a lot of weight on is my interview with the student. I know that this is a touchy one, but for me personally, I have to enjoy having conversations with my students because that's basically my job. And from that point forward is to have conversations with the person. And then of course I do look at grades and GREs and letters of recommendation, but I would say 90% of the weight I'm putting on the research statement and the interview. And I'm looking at grades and in courses and GREs only to make sure that any student I want to work with is going to be able to handle the coursework here. I would have already made my decision that there was a fit before I started applying any sort of scrutiny to grades, et cetera. If I used any sort of threshold on grades, I would have excluded myself from this program. So I would not do that.
I would just want to emphasize one aspect of the application that I personally think is the most important. I spend the most time reviewing, which is the statement of purpose, or what sometimes is called the research statement. That's the place where applicants write what are they interested in a scholarly way, and why might they imagine my lab to be a home where they could cultivate those interests and be successful. And I really do look closely at those essays because I think that that's the place in an application where applicants can really articulate why this would be a strong academic home for them, how they might contribute to the ongoing work of the lab in general, and what kinds of things we would get to talk about and have fun doing science together about. And I think that for me is where, if I'm start being excited about an applicant, I really dig in and read every line of that essay.
For this piece of writing, and for any piece of writing, an important general piece of advice is show, don't tell. Or if you're going to tell, show also, right? Anyone can say, I am so passionate about this. But then when you're describing it and your understanding of it seems to be pretty shallow, well, how passionate can you be? On the other hand, if you write a detailed, thoughtful, knowledge-based description of what you're interested in doing and why, you don't have to tell me that you're passionate about it because you've clearly already put in the effort to really understand what you're talking about and give a clear explanation of why you want to do it. You know, the important thing is to demonstrate your commitment and your skills and not just report that you have them.
I think sometimes when we say personal statement, for the applicants who are on the younger side, what comes to mind is the statements that they wrote as undergraduates for college. This is radically different genre, right? The questions I'm going to be trying to answer first and foremost by looking at this is, what is your research experience? What are the questions that you're interested in answering? And getting a demonstration of how you think as a theorist, as an intellectual, someone who tries to bridge between data, right, and cognitive theories. And then only secondarily am I going to be looking for a coherent personal narrative, right? So if you go in and give me your life story without answering those other questions, I'm going to be missing what I really need. And so here's a place where another rule of general good writing applies, right? Not just do you want to show and not tell, you want to be thinking of your audience. Your audience here is faculty members who are excited about research and want to know how your excitement and their excitement can come together.
Big sort of, I would almost describe it as a mistake, is the sort of undergrad style first paragraph, which Jesse alluded to, where for me it can be usually a distraction. I'm not necessarily interested in how you came to be interested in memory, let's say, that's what you're pitching and presenting as the thing you're interested in, unless it really is deeply integrated into what you're hoping to do. And usually it's not. So I would say if there's a personal angle and it's real and it's deep, go for it, put it in there. It could give your statement some pop, but don't force it. It's fine if you basically cut to the chase of what you're interested in, what your thoughts are about it, why you think it's such an interesting problem, why you want to spend years and years of your life and learn from somebody who's well established in the field to give you the tools and techniques. You could present all of that without really telling me how you got to be that person. And so if it's just, you know, you took classes and you were into it and you did some research and you loved it, that's fine for me. If there's more to it, don't edit it out. By all means, put it in there, but you just don't have to force a personal narrative unless you really feel like it's a deep part of your goals as a graduate student. And I know for some people in some areas of research, that could be really true.
Personal statement is your chance to make a personal appeal to another human being or set of human beings who will make an important decision about you. Be honest. Be yourself, tell the truth, because you don't want a relationship, a mentoring relationship with somebody who doesn't want you for who you really are.
I like reading personal statements because it's the chance to sort of see how they're framing themselves. And I think one common, not mistake, but maybe misconception, or again, this is speaking from my experience, is that people want to say all the things they did and the process they followed, which I like to hear, I really do. But I also like to hear if they tell me why and what they found, not just that they worked in the lab, but what question did they ask and what did they find from their data? Even if the answer was, actually, we ran a bunch of things and we didn't find anything, but you know, like I just something that shows not just the process of the steps, but then the motivation, like the scientific curiosity, the question that drove that you were asking. I want to hear about that, and the people who will, so that way I can see how you talk about science and how you're thinking about the questions you're engaging in as you're on your journey. So I like the journey, but also don't just tell me the journey. Tell me some of the meat of the stuff that you learned. Another thing that is sort of a toggle that I can often tell is when sentences could be written by anyone or just you. So when there's usually that paragraph somewhere in the end that's like, and I want to work at Harvard specifically with Talia Kunkel and so and so and so and so for the following reasons, and then you write like what it is. And I can tell the people who took the sentence off my webpage, which is good, they read my webpage, they found the thing, like, and I see the connection. I don't doubt that their interest is real, but there's that extra step that says why, like what about that fits with your interest, that the part that only you could write that no one else would write. So if you read a sentence and you're like, anyone could have written this sentence, then you can tell I'm not going to learn as much about you as if you read each sentence, you're like, only I could write that sentence. And so for me, when I look at applications, I love the journey, but I love when they give me a little bit of scientific nugget to chew on and they tell me something that only they could have written, and those stand out to me.
I look for evidence that the person has really understood what we do in my lab, and for evidence that they can see a connection between their interest and goals and what we're doing. And then I look for a description of their experience to find some pattern that suggests that they really do understand what the life would be like that they'd be getting into. And then more broadly, I look for writing skill, because writing is, you know, clearly and persuasively is such an important part of communication in our field. The papers that we publish will be noticed by people if they're written clearly and easily understandable and written in a way that's compelling. And so students who can put words together in a way that predicts that they could do that well in scientific publications have a leg up, you know, in as I review many, many different personal statements.
I guess it fits with what we've been talking about so far, which is, you know, when you read an application, you're looking for a holistic picture. And so I usually, like, we kind of go right to the personal statement first to just kind of understand what what brought them to apply. And then when I check grades, now this is how I do it, I don't know how other people do it. Mostly what I do is actually look to see the distribution of classes that they've taken, mostly so I can understand what they're interested in. Like, oh, look, they took a lot of math on the side, or look, they did foreign language training here. Like, so I'm using their classes not to see did they get all A's, but actually to see what they chose to take and what they chose, you know, what their sort of, what their background knowledge coming into the lab is, to get a sense of who they are. And I'll check, if I see a low grade, I'll check it. And so, but again, it's such a small weight in the big picture that usually, I don't know, actually, I mean, usually it doesn't even come up, or I'll note it, but if other parts of the application just either it's addressed directly, there's a line like, oh, I was moving, or I had a health issue, like, great, good, I don't even think about it. So it, you know, in truth, the actual GPA for me doesn't weigh too heavily into what I'm trying to learn when I read an application. The class distribution is what I look at when I look at people's transcripts.
Kind of on the extreme end of this, where I really don't care about the GPA or the GRE. I mean, if somebody has a really abysmal GPA, then I'd kind of like to understand why that happened. But I just have not seen a very strong correlation between these kinds of metrics and people's intellectual abilities. Because I've interacted with people where I know that they're technically sophisticated, but they have a lousy quantitative GRE score. So I'm going to give, it's not that the GRE scores and GPA are totally uninformative, but I'm just going to give priority to the other more tangible things that I know about that applicant.
Faculty are people. We've all lived lives. We know that stuff happens. My own personal story, plenty of experience getting grades that I'm not proud of, that in a certain instance held me back from grad school. And I think lots of people have something like that happen to them. And what you want to do is not see that as the threat that is going to prevent you from succeeding, but as the challenge that you've overcome. And so using that in your personal statement, either as an opportunity to explain the circumstances of what happened, because sometimes it's just enough to provide a compelling explanation. Alternatively, if that was part of your personal narrative that you've then grown from, like if it was an opportunity that you took feedback and made different decisions, had new experiences after that because of it, that's also an important part of your personal story that your advisor would be interested in.
One of the things about scientific research is that it mostly fails. Like most of the things that we try don't work, and rare things succeed. And we get wonderful positive feedback, but we get hard negative feedback. We get manuscripts that we think are going to change the world that get rejected from 3 journals in a row. And one of the biggest challenges for graduate students is resilience and persistence and overcoming those inevitable difficulties. And so if there are challenges that you've overcome or times in your life that you've been resilient, demonstrating that ability to persevere is one of the most valuable things that you can do to set yourself apart. And there are times when it kind of turns lemons into lemonade to be able to say, you'll see on my transcript, or you'll see from whatever, this situation, but let me show you how I persevered, and here I am today, stronger and wiser for it. There's a sense in which that's almost a plus over somebody who hasn't yet been challenged in that way, and so we don't know yet, maybe they don't know about themselves, how they would handle it.
I think there's also 2 grade situations that we are so familiar with that we all are able to read them pretty quickly, and they often get mentioned in the personal statement, right? One of them is the person who starts college and in their first year or so gets some really bad grades first 2 years and then comes back roaring. We know what that means. We understand. You found your legs, you were able to start walking, right? And we can put that in context. The other one is somebody who went to college like 4 or 5 years ago, has now devoted their life to this field. And we know that your grades are not particularly relevant at this point. right? And we're going to evaluate them differently than someone who's coming right out of school. I think the lower grades that are a lot harder to explain are the ones that come very recently, right? And then you might want to think about if you do apply 1 year and it doesn't work out, what you can do in the interim to show that that is not reflective of you and your willingness and ability to handle academic work right now.
I think it really depends a lot on what the person wants to do. I mean, there are some areas of psychology that are indistinguishable from research in other fields. So for example, someone can be coming from economics and studying social behavior, and you wouldn't be able to tell from looking at their research that it's economics research instead of psychology research. And really, it's not one or the other, it's the research that it is, and it happens that it could fall in other departments.
As you might imagine, I've had people from all sorts of different backgrounds come through my lab, and I've even advised people who weren't getting PhDs in psychology at all. I had one student who got a PhD in physics. So yeah, the specific background doesn't matter as long as you have the right experience. The most important thing is that I consider, and I think most people, at least in our department, consider psychology as an empirical discipline where you do experiments and you build theories to explain those experimental data. And if you're not on board with that kind of general methodology, then not only will you probably not enjoy a PhD in psychology, but you're just it's going to be an uphill battle for you psychologically, right? And the people around you are not going to be answering the same questions that you're trying to answer. So it's really important to ask yourself whether you're trying to solve an engineering problem, in which case you should be in an engineering discipline, right? You're trying to build things, artifacts that solve particular problems, versus an empirical discipline where you're trying to explain natural phenomena.
I do believe that what we're interested in is phenomena, topics, questions, and that academic disciplines are just bureaucratic entities that are different means of studying them. However, when you are becoming a professional, when you're going into graduate school, when you're planning a career, what you really need to focus on, if you're interested in a topic, is what do I like to do? Because your success as a graduate student and ultimately as a professional is going to depend on whether you like to fill your days with the kind of activities that are the coin of the realm in that particular discipline. If you're going into psychology, you almost certainly have to enjoy doing experiments or other forms of data gathering. Data sets are another route, but one way or another, you've got to like data, because there are very, very few people who get jobs as psychologists, who get PhDs as psychologists, who don't make some empirical contribution. And it's the way in which what you do when you wake up in the morning and spend your hours and then go to bed that's going to determine your happiness and your success. So I look at, especially in statements, some realization by the applicant that that's what is going to be required of them, and that they really enjoy doing it. They know that that's what they're in for, they're prepared to do it, and that's what helps determine a good match above and beyond intellectual interests between the applicant and the program.
I can say that at this point, I think fewer than half of our successful applicants got their undergraduate degree in psychology. We have people coming in from philosophy, from neuroscience, from mathematics, from linguistics, and it's never brought up in a meeting of the CHD, the committee that looks at admissions. And most of my colleagues, all my colleagues who I've talked about this question with directly, none of them has ever said to me that you need a psychology degree.
I mean, just out of curiosity, how many of us have an undergraduate degree in psychology?
I do.
Yeah, and two of us don't.
One thing that's an important trend is, at least in the fields that I participate in, things are getting increasingly quantitatively sophisticated. And if you are coming from a discipline that, tends to impart strong quantitative skills and thinking, that can actually be an advantage.
We end up having to pull people from other disciplines with stronger quantitative training, if that's the kind of work that you're doing. And hopefully that will change in the future. But for now, I think, you know, particularly for the kinds of work I do, it's pretty essential to look more broadly.
One of the high level ways I think about it is some people like to study the brain in order to gain insight into how the mind works. So the question is fundamentally about a psychological process, whether it be memory or perception or something else. And if you consider the brain as a tool that will illuminate answers about that psychological process, that might be the kind of perspective that would align with a PhD in psychology. Some neuroscience research is really focused on how the brain works, with or without connection to understanding psychological phenomena explicitly. So you could study the workings of a circuit in the brain, or a network or system, or how the brain is organized into brain networks. That may or may not ever reach all the way to psychology in terms of its the insights gained. And so I think sometimes it might be helpful to ask yourself, are the questions that keep me up at night, that I'm the most passionate and interested in, fundamentally ones about psychology and the mind, or are they ones that may be more classified as trying to illuminate how the brain works? And that might be a place of distinction. I would add one more thing, which is that neuroscience programs have a different structure in that students typically do rotations for the first 2 years before they land on a particular lab and a particular project. So if that's appealing to gain a general understanding of many different levels of analysis of how to study the brain, that's something that comes with the territory in a neuroscience PhD program, whereas in general psychology programs, individuals would jump right into one lab and start focusing on one set of questions.
Perfect.
There's not a single answer, so I'll give my own perspective. For me, having some experience in scientific research and thinking, and I mean that very broadly, like in the sciences, is more or less necessary. If it's even a student who looked wonderful in every other way, if they had no background doing any kind of scientific research, I would probably say you're best off taking a year or two and getting that experience. Because I really think that answering scientific questions using experimental data is a skill kind of like riding a bike, and it just takes a certain amount of time riding the bike, getting the feel of it and those intangible skills to be ready to hit the ground running in your first year. On the other hand, I do think that, I mean, of course, it's wonderful if you've done research in psychology. It's especially wonderful if you've done research in the area that your advisor has, but I don't hold that as a kind of must-have. Somebody who has done really great research in, you know, Josh mentioned economics or biology or neuroscience, I would feel could be perfectly qualified to come in and work in my lab, because I think that the specific content that you need to do the research that I do in my lab, one can get enough of in their first year that they can hit the ground running pretty well, as long as they know how to ride a bike.
I know that many of my colleagues at other institutions, because of the constraints on their lives, have very different answers. If you're going to be supporting a graduate student off of a grant and you need to get that up and running quickly, then specific skill sets may be very important. And so I think we'd be doing you a disfavor if we didn't mention that. I'll also say that this is a place where I probably have a slightly different answer than Fiery due to some of the constraints of the kind of research I do. So in the developmental group, we often have to think about the question of people who are interested in developmental questions, but have no prior experience in experimental work with children. And as a group, we generally do not take those folks. Now, if they want to do modeling or something else that doesn't involve experimental work with children, that's a different question. They may be totally ready to do that. But in our experience, people who are interested in the intellectual program, but have no direct experience with it, often massively underestimate the amount of sheer persistence and hard work that is required, and the very piecemeal step-by-step way in which we have to answer our questions. And so what we typically do in those cases is encourage them to go back and get that experience before they make that life decision.
What really matters in terms of research experience is that it's kind of a filter that helps show that the applicant knows what they're in for, that they really know how they're going to be spending their time, that they don't come in and think, oh, geez, I didn't know that I'd have to actually deal with kids or program visual displays. And this speaks to one of the key things that I look for in applications, and that is the realization of the applicant that you're not just continuing as a student. I want someone who knows that they are now making a transition. It's no longer just education, it's professional training. You're training to become a professor or a researcher in the private sector or a clinician, but you're making the transition from just reading, taking courses, and writing papers, that is assimilating existing knowledge to creating new knowledge. And research experience just shows that you know what that involves, that even having done it, you know that it's what you want to continue to do.
I'm not sure there's a general rule. I would say if someone didn't have any laboratory experience, then that would be a tough sell for me. If you can avoid it, you don't want to do things that you don't know whether or not you're going to like doing them. And that's especially true if you're going to commit yourself to like a long-term, relatively poorly paid path that is only going to be rewarding to the extent that you're intellectually and emotionally invested, right? And so before taking that plunge, you want to know that you're really into that. So you have to just do it, right? And that's why I advise all undergrads that will listen to me that they should do to be a research assistant before they apply to grad school, so they have that chance to gain more experience.
There is a huge difference between being a consumer versus a producer of scientific research. And you see applicants who took a bunch of psychology classes and got good grades in them and really liked them, and they say, I like psychology, give me more, right? But this is like the difference between being a film buff and being a filmmaker. They are completely, I mean, you have to have, as a filmmaker, you have to have essentially all of the interests of a film buff. But that's just the beginning, right? And so some people can have so little experience with actually producing psychology that they don't even realize what it is that they don't have in a Dunning-Kruger kind of way, right? And so it is just absolutely essential that people not just say, but show in their essays and have it shown for them, we hope, through their letter writers, that they have an understanding of what they're talking about getting into as a producer of science, as opposed to someone who just finds the products of it interesting, because those are just completely different things.
Deciding to go to grad school as opposed to continuing to work at the job you're working at, or going out and looking for a job, or doing whatever other thing you could be doing with your life, that's a big consequential decision.
Our discussion so far is focused on, how can I get into a graduate program? I think an important question is, do I want to get into a graduate program? And the best way to find out is to live the life. And if you're a freshman or a sophomore, if you can find a lab to work in and build a relationship and sustain it over years, you will learn so much about what the day-to-day life is like that you would be in for in grad school and beyond in your profession.
It's certainly not everybody who enjoys producing psychological research. And finding out if you're the kind of person who enjoys that, it's a really important piece of information that you should have probably before you make that commitment. And so it's really not just something that the faculty want to have, but it's something that you should want to have as well.
This is another one where the answer is going to depend on the details. So I think that certainly any work experience is going to lead to some skill building and character growth one way or the other, even if it's simply handling people or what have you. But to the extent that you're entering a more technically oriented program, the quantitative skills, if your job happened to help you build quantitative skills, of course you would talk about that. If it was a project-based job, you could talk about how you, contributed to projects, et cetera. So I could see a lot of ways in which the real-world experience is relevant. I don't personally even think about the age of the person, and if they do have real-world experience, I'm assuming that has made them more mature, and that their decision is sort of less of a default decision and more of an ambition. So it could be a selling point, and it could be a strength if the skills and knowledge, or even just the drive, is coming from that real world experience. So I think it's something that one could easily present as a major strength.
I have people like that in my lab, and I have people like that have come through my lab before. Sort of neither helps nor hurts necessarily, or it can sometimes help depending on what you've done. Like I think that if you come from a software engineering if you have an experience in software engineering, that's often really useful because it means that you're going to be a disciplined programmer in ways that are not really taught even for computer science students as undergrads. And you can really see the difference for the people who have had that versus who haven't. But the thing is that doesn't substitute for research experience. So you still need to have some research experience, because otherwise I'm too risk averse to take someone who's never done something. And I'm risk seeking in a lot of ways, but what I don't want to do is be unpleasantly surprised that someone started doing something and figured out quickly that they just don't want to be there doing that kind of thing, when they could have figured that out by just having a little bit of research experience.
Work experience isn't weighed the same way because it's not experienced with the same thing. We want to know that you know what you're in for. As far as older students go, I think that's not only okay. In my case, the older I got, the more I wanted students who had experience. Really, in the last 5 or 10 years, I almost wouldn't consider a student who was coming straight out of college. I wanted people who were actually in their late 20s and early 30s. I found that they were more mature and more committed. So that's not to say that that's how every professor feels. That's to say that no matter what age you are, there's somebody out there who probably favors your age group. Don't cut yourself short. Apply to the places you want to go. Don't decide beforehand that you don't meet the criteria. Let us decide that you don't meet the criteria.
I feel like there's a few different kinds of application files I've seen fall into this category. One that is really easy to evaluate is the sort of person who has graduated and now spent, say, between 1 and 5 years in a field that might or might not be related, who is interested in psychology and potentially psychology graduate or cognitive science, right, at the point when they finish their undergraduate. And I can evaluate them in very much the same way that I would a typical applicant, right? And of course, adding what George did, that they've had some other life experiences. I frankly work a little bit better with people who are a tiny bit older, like late 20s to early 30s is my favorite developmental period. Another kind of person that we sometimes run into is somebody who has been going on a completely different life trajectory, has had a career for a very long time, and now is coming back and really starting something very new at a much later stage in their life. For that person, I think there's questions that they have to ask themselves about how willing are you to go through a postdoctoral period of relatively low pay where you might have to move from university to university? How willing are you to go through the kind of struggle that it takes to get tenure, right? And so interview there would be really critical to understand just how flexible this person's life is and where they're heading now. And then the third category are as a group of people who I love to have dinner with, but I really want to avoid having in my lab. And those are the professional seekers, right? These are people who have done amazing things. They've become cooks. They've traveled the world. They've studied 4 or 5 different topics. Often they have a string of graduate degrees behind them. They are seeking some deep understanding of the world to bring themselves into alignment with it. And I have to admit that with seekers, I get nervous because seekers tend to go on seeking. And I don't want to be, thing number 5 in a list of 10 or 20 things that someone tries in their life.
I think the references need to be from people who know you well, right? If you took a class and you got an A in the class, that's great, but we know you got an A in the class from your transcript, right? That these really need to be the people who can speak to your grit and determination, to what you're like to work with as a person, and to your intellectual style and abilities, that can tell us the things that we can't get from the numbers, right? I think a mistake that people might make is that more is better. That I actually think, and this is almost more of a sort of weird trick rather than like a deep piece of advice, but people tend to think in terms of averages instead of totals, right? And you'd be better off having 3 or even 2 really strong letters from people who know you well, and that's it, than having that watered down with some positive, nothing negative said, but very generic letters, right? So you don't need to get a whole crowd behind you, a small number, ideally 3, but even if it's just 1 or 2, who people can really bring you to life as a person, that, and as a scientist, that's what really matters the most.
The best recommendation letters I've seen are ones that can really give that type of concrete details. So I think sometimes people get letters from people that may be really well known, but may not know you really well. And those I think are sometimes less successful than maybe someone who's a little less well known, but who knows you really well and can speak to your unique qualities that you're going to bring to our labs.
There are also things applicants can do to help their letter writers write a strong letter. For one, when you ask somebody if they would write you a letter of recommendation, it might be advisable to ask them if they're willing to write you a strong letter. In faculty speak, what that means is, will they advocate for me in the path I'm choosing to go in or intending to go in? Sometimes when students ask me if I'll write a strong letter, but I really don't feel that I know them well, I might write back and say, I'm happy to write you a letter, but it might be just short of strong, because I don't actually have the kind of deep experiences I would need to write a letter that has that rich detail that some people look for. And then it would be up to the applicant to decide, do I want a letter that I can provide, or might I search for someone who knows me better or can speak in more detail? Another thing I might suggest is to provide the letter writers a lot of information about you, to make it easy for them to provide that rich detail that Mark mentioned. This includes providing them a draft of your statement of purpose or your personal statement, that they can help echo some of the themes that you're planning to write about in it, to provide background information about your education, to provide a CV or a resume that will give them sort of a look at your full background, not just what they have seen directly, but the larger arc of your development. And also sometimes, especially for people I'm writing letters for who I had as a student in an undergraduate course, I sometimes ask them to provide me back with any feedback that I provided them across the semester about their work. So if you wrote a final paper and I provided you feedback about how great it was, if you could remind me of what that feedback said, then I could actually put it into the letter in a lot more detail than I might be able to recall myself. So this is just to say that it's not just asking, can you write a letter? Okay, great, thanks, here's the deadline, but rather to provide those letter writers scaffolding that will help them write you a really rich, detailed letter, which represents the strongest letters of all.
Is it important that your letter writers are famous or well known? And I just assume that, that's a sort of guessing game now you're playing. Is this professor going to know this person? And there's a few ones that are obvious, but then there's a big scope of gray area where most everyone else falls. And I just assume I don't know everyone that's doing really important research as well. And for me, what's more important is specific details about the person. So, if they worked for, if you worked for them for a summer doing something completely different, but they can speak to some of your qualities and skills and how, if you're hardworking and can persevere, like that's sort of what matters to me, is sort of the specifics. So from my point of view, I mean, I think everyone kind of, like we said, we're all trying to get a holistic picture in different ways. And for me, I find that the letters that may be from a less famous person but can speak to you specifically, I found those more informative.
The mistake I see a lot of folks make is going for a super prestigious person who does not know them. That really shows up negatively. We can see through that, and it feels kind of icky and uncomfortable. Another common situation that undergraduates find themselves in is they have a research mentor, a graduate student, or a postdoc they've worked really closely with who really knows them, and a faculty member who maybe only knows them more distantly, right? One thing I would suggest you do is make sure you get the feedback from that research, from that postdoc or graduate student into the letter. And there's two strategies for doing this. It varies across labs. You can get letters from both of them if you don't have other good people who would be ideal. A very common strategy, though, is asking them to write the letter together. So I often do that, and I'll take big quotes out from what the graduate student said, and I'll say, like, look, she knows them much better than I do, and here's what they had to say. Next, I think this is the issue of cross-disciplinarity, right? We do care about letters from people who aren't in psychology. In fact, the letter that probably persuaded me the most in all those I've ever read was a letter from a logician telling me that this student had the cleanest mind that they had ever run into, and they were right. That letter was dead on, and I was very impressed. And then I guess there's one thing that's a little bit in conflict with my don't go with the famous person advice, which is that we all weight letters more when we know the person who is providing the letter. So if there are connections between the current labs that you're working in, right? Or if you're working with somebody whose viewpoint will matter, that really is useful. And it also kind of applies to categories of people, right? When you get a recommendation from, if you were, say, a resident assistant in a dorm, and you get a recommendation from someone who supervised you in that capacity, they might not know what we're looking for in a psychology letter. They're going to be less apt to be able to provide that. So people who, for example, review psychology graduate applications, they're going to provide you letters that contain more of the relevant content. You also have another wedge to control that content, and that is the information that you give to your letter writers. You should make sure that they have your CV, that they have a copy of your statement, and that they know anything specific they need to know about what you're saying about your research interests.
What I look for in my interviews is whether or not the student thinks about what I say. Because if I can't get through to the student and teach them some things, or hopefully inform the decisions that they're making, give them advice that they take, then they don't need me. So I want somebody who listens, who hears, who processes what I say. And I guess, there's different versions of somebody who struggles with that. One person is super defensive and just defends their line of thought no matter what you said. Another person might not fully understand what you're saying and struggle with the concepts that you're throwing at them. And then maybe that means that person doesn't have the right background to work with you, or maybe that means that as an advisor, I would understand that's something I have to work on. I have to build some foundational knowledge if I decide to work with this person. I think it's important to be very well informed about the faculty members' research. And usually I try to give students a heads up about the kinds of things we're working on now. And then I ask people about the work that they've done. So having a very clear presentation of your own research is probably the most important thing, I think, because what often happens is people don't present research well. So they'll start with the details of the experiment instead of the motivation for the experiment. What was the question? Why did you think it was interesting? How did you approach it? How did it pan out? Are you still working on it? What are the follow-ups? Did you think of this? Did you think of that? So knowing your own work and presenting it in a clear way, I think, is probably the best way to show that you're ready for this. And then, knowing the lab's work is the way to show that this is a good fit, that this is a good place for you. You're well informed about what's going on here. You know what you like, you know what this lab likes, and you think there's a fit. And if you really believe that, then probably the faculty member would agree. Hardest thing to do is get that description of your research at the right level, not too detailed, not too superficial. I would work on that and practice it with people who, people around me, a roommate, a mom, a dad, anybody who is willing to listen to your pitch and see if what you're saying makes sense. And usually the pitch is too focused and narrow and in the weeds. So popping up and remembering what the big picture was and what the motivation for the work was. That's I think what separates a lot of front runner candidates for us from people with research experience who don't really seem to have a mastery. If you're a student who worked on a project but you really don't know what all the big questions were really about, you just push part of the project forward. There's a difference there, and you could usually notice it from how people describe the work.
Definitely, starting with what George said. First question I usually ask is, tell me a little bit about the project you've been most deeply intellectually involved in. And as he said, the biggest issue there is curse of knowledge. You know about the details that you'll forget how much I don't know. I don't mind if I hear something that I've actually learned before. It'll actually get me up and moving, get my mind working. So it's always better to assume too little rather than too much. After that, I will often ask people, what kind of question do you want to work on in graduate school? Or maybe I'll pick up on their essay and say, it sounded to me like you were interested in this. Have you thought more about it? Where do you think you're heading now? I will oftentimes ask them what other programs they're interested in at this point and why. So kind of who's on their short list. That's not just so that I can suss out how likely you are to go somewhere else. I mean, that's part of it. But it's also so I can get a sense of what is the coherence of your intellectual interests and how aware are you of what's going on in the rest of the field. I'll usually ask 5 to 10 years from now, what do you see yourself doing? Just to get a sense of what people's life plans are and how open. And then, you know, sometimes there'll just be questions to kind of get things moving. Like if you were to suddenly decide you weren't going to go to graduate school, what would you do instead is one of my favorite ones. And then, you know, a lot of times you're going to always be asked, I think, do you have questions for me? And that's your point to ask about what the lab is up to if that hasn't come out yet, right? Or to ask about what populations are available, or to try to start more general things like, what do you think predicts success in graduate school? Or if you were thinking about spending the summer before you went to graduate school over again, what would you do? Right? So think about what you want to do if you get control of the conversation.
Basically, when I talk to people, I want to understand how they think, right? It all kind of comes back to how do you think? And to the extent that you can illustrate to me how you think, that's really helpful in understanding whether we're compatible and think about problems in similar or different ways. And so, you know, all right, so in a concrete manifestation of this is if you've done some research, there is a failure mode in these interviews where if I ask you, describe to me a little bit about your research, you'll say, well, first I did experiment X, then I did experiment Y, and then, you know, then I wrote paper A, then I wrote paper B. And it's essentially like just a list of things that you did. That's not very helpful because what that basically signals is that somebody told you step by step what to do and you basically executed it robotically. And what really matters is not all the specific details of what you did, but to show that you understand the problem that you're trying to solve. You understood the different constraints on the solution and how you wrestled with that problem and came up with an experiment. And you tried to control for these things. And how did you analyze the results? How did you figure out what the right analysis was? What kinds of questions did that research project open up for future research, right? That shows how you think about research, right? That's much more helpful.
When I am talking to students, I pay a lot of attention to what their interests are, but I pay relatively more attention to what they can tell me about their past than about their future. I assume that their future interests will change a little bit and they're naturally going to develop and grow in whatever program they end up in. But I'm very interested in knowing, you know, how do they think about the work that they've done in the past? What did they take away from it and what are their interests today?
The clinical area, we're not training people to be clinicians, but for many people who do work in our area, it's really valuable to have, first of all, it's a required part of the training to do clinical placements every year from year 2 on. It's a requirement that they do a full-time 1-year internship. And then it's very valuable for research credibility credentials to have a license in some state, a clinical practice license, even if you don't practice clinically. And for all those reasons, we do, some of us anyway, do look during the interview process for interpersonal skills because, you know, there are cases in which we think we can't imagine a particular candidate being successful or even comfortable in the clinical roles that they'll have to play in practicum and internship placements, and that could be a challenge. So I don't think that issue might necessarily arise in other areas, but for us, since you asked for specifics, that's something that I think people think about in clinical faculty when they do these interviews.
No, right? The ideal applicant, if there were an ideal applicant for one lab, they would not be ideal for another because we use very different methods because the skills and knowledge you need to go in vary. But I think for most labs, they're still not ideal applicants. I've worked with radically different kinds of people. Some of them are fast and perfectionistic and resilient. Others of them are spacey and take the questions going off in other directions and disappear for a few months and come back with beautiful things. And I've enjoyed both of these experiences. So no.
The thing is that if there was an ideal applicant, then of course you would be obliged to accept that ideal applicant every time that person appeared. And then you just have a lab full of ideal applicants, and that would be super boring, right? Because presumably they'd all kind of do the same ideal things.
If you're asking if there's a formula that creates an ideal applicant, I would say definitely no. I think people can come from all sorts of backgrounds with all sorts of experiences and end up in that space of being extremely prepared for PhD studies and exhibiting a strong fit with a potential mentor who's reviewing the application. So I don't think that there's a checklist of things you should check off in order to get to that place. I think that people can arrive at that destination through all sorts of journeys. And I would also add, applicants don't always have a full picture of what faculty members are looking for in a student for their group. And so trying to reverse engineer yourself to appear ideal might also backfire, because you don't have a fully fleshed out understanding of exactly what criteria or what factors that a particular faculty member might weight more strongly.
If you're looking a year ahead and you're choosing courses to take in your final year as an undergraduate student, and sometimes people ask me, what courses should I take? And there's an answer to that, and that is take math courses. And the reason is, there's a lot that you can learn when you're at any point in your life. Ideally, you must be learning throughout your lifespan. There's some things that you learn better when you're in university, not just because you've got a younger brain, but because when you are incentivized to do problem sets, to study for exams, you can learn certain kinds of material like math better than if you're just lying in bed reading a book. And now people do educate themselves in math later in their careers, but it's typically the kind of thing that is best acquired as an undergraduate. So the kinds of math that are relevant to whatever you're going into, particularly probability and statistics, but also theory of computation, linear algebra, depending on what you're going into. While you're an undergraduate, that's the best time to take those courses.
As it happens, I've actually written a reading list, which can be downloaded on my website. So I'm not sure if there's any point rehashing that reading list. I think that apart from reading widely in cognitive science, and there are a few important books, that I think having a sense of research process and research philosophy, sort of the meta research questions, is good to have in mind before you start, because sometimes people can kind of lose their way and forget why exactly they're doing things and what makes a good experiment and what makes a good theory. And so there are some papers that I recommend to students as highlighting this, sort of highlighting the need, for example, for theory and guiding experimental research. I mean, that's my big thing. Not everybody sees it the same way. So for example, John Platt's paper on strong inference is one such paper, and another paper called Can a Biologist Fix a Radio? That's another favorite of mine that I have my students read.
Students in the clinical graduate program have to be incredible multitaskers, because there's all the academic requirements and research expectations, and simply the need to do good research to be good in your profession, plus all of the clinical requirements that are required for accreditation. And so many of our students from second year of grad student on are working up to 2 days a week full-time in a clinical setting, getting the clinical component of their training, and then they have to add all the other requirements of graduate school. And so for one thing we look for in choosing applicants is, are they good multitaskers?
One thing to know about clinical psychology programs is they tend to range on a continuum from ones that are more sort of practice focused to ones that are more research focused. And so I think programs that are more on the practice side do tend to like to see students having some sort of experience in clinical work. Now, obviously not as a clinician because you wouldn't be trained yet, but to have worked in clinical settings and to have some of those experiences. I think programs that tend to be more on the research side, like Harvard's, I think maybe put a little bit less emphasis on the clinical work side, but definitely value experience in clinical research. And what I mean by that is either working in labs like Professor Weiss's that do work on clinical treatments with clinical populations, or in labs that do work on trying to understand, you know, nosology or diagnosis or pathophysiology of psychopathology. And there are often, I think, some distinct issues involved in working with clinical and patient populations. And so having that clinical research background and some experience before grad school can be really helpful in terms of, I think in particular, knowing that that's a good fit for you and that you want to be doing the clinical research.
I mean, I think the best way to do that and to answer most questions about goodness of fit of training is to comb through in detail the website for the department, and then go to each individual faculty member's website and comb through that in detail to figure out who's got skills of particular kinds. And then you can identify which programs have good representation of the skills you're looking for. DBT, you wouldn't find a lot of DBT training in our program, for example, and you would find it at, say, University of Washington Clinical Psychology program. But the way to find out would be to go through the electronic media in a way that, you know, is very, very feasible these days.
Quick thing I'd add too is if you're having trouble figuring some of that out from the website after you've come that over, is there's each program will have a director of clinical training who you can reach out to, who can answer questions about training you might get outside of the department. So when you're doing your clinical practica, for instance, they might be able to speak to the different options that are available and the different modalities, treatment modalities that you can learn.
Yeah, a good point. Another thing to look for is what are the practicum placement opportunities going to be that are authorized within a particular program. So we have a set of practicum placements in hospitals, clinics, assessment institutions that we typically rely on for the practicum placements that students go into in year 2 and beyond. And by reviewing what those are, one could determine very easily what kinds of skills are going to be available in the training regimen that is possible within a particular program.
It's a clinical program and a clinical psych program. Every program, even the most research-focused ones, are going to have, as John's mentioned, clinical training that's a requirement. So I think it's more, again, trying to get a sense of whether the school, where they are on that continuum from more research-focused to more practice-focused, and departments do and programs do differ on that dimension. So I think fit is so important in figuring out ahead of time, do you want a program that's more on the research side or more on the practice side? And to the extent to which you are really much more interested in the practice side, I think if you go to a research-heavy program that sometimes has limits on the number of clinical hours that you'll get within a particular week, for instance, then the fit may not be as good because the emphasis in the program will be much more on the research side of things. So I think good to try and suss that out in advance on where the program falls on that and what you think is going to be the best fit for you in terms of the training that you want.
Sometimes it will take a little digging to determine for a particular department and clinical program how research or clinically focused they are, because they're all going to try to present a good face to the public. And so digging into the websites, seeing what research the faculty are doing, how productive they have been, and then if there's any way to find out what the graduates of the program are doing in their careers, that in a way, I mean, if I had to pick one indicator of the orientation of a program, that would be it. If most of their graduates are going into faculty positions in universities, makes it very likely that program is heavily research oriented in its training. And if very few of them are, and most of them are in clinical practice, that tells a story as well. Neither is good nor bad necessarily, but it's a matter of fitting to an applicant's personal goals. The one other thing I'll add, in some programs, including ours, there is a clinical accreditation track, and almost all students do that, and that's the one that involves a practicum placement from year 2 beyond to all the rest of the years of graduate school and a full-time clinical internship. But it's also possible to opt for experimental psychopathology, and that program allows you to opt out of all the clinical practicum placements, and you don't have to do an internship, and you're committed totally to doing clinical research for the rest of your career. And that's perfectly fine too. Most of our grad students want the clinical track because it allows them a range of options for their careers later. But in every year, I think in every year of our program, there have been 1 or 2 students who opt for the experimental psychopathology track. So that is an option if you want to do nothing but research.
I think we have students who have faculty mentors in the social area and the MBB area and even allied disciplines in the maybe School of Education or public health, for instance, if it's relevant to their research. So I think Harvard is a place that really does encourage that for students for whom it makes sense.
We've had students whose primary work is based in Harvard Medical School, and they have and their primary mentor for research is a faculty member over there in the medical school, and they'll have an advisor who helps monitor meeting all the requirements of the department and the clinical program, and teams up with the faculty member in the medical school or in the other settings that Mark mentioned as a research advisor. So what the path that often followed is that a student comes in planning to work with someone who's a faculty member in the clinical program, and then over time they develop an interest that's so strong outside the clinical faculty that becomes their primary research mentorship. But very few people come in with that as the initial plan.
All of this advice that we've been talking about is really looking at the PI as this gatekeeper, and you're trying to get into the head of the PI and convince them how good you are. But you should also be thinking about how good the PI is, right? Not just in general, but also for you specifically. So a big lesson that I learned from being a PI is that people are really different and need different things in terms of mentorship. Initially, the bias, I think, for new PIs is that they kind of project onto everybody what their experience was, because that's really all they had to go on. And then you gradually learn that people need different things. They work at different timescales. So there's certain things that I do that are really uniform across students. Like I meet with all the students the same amount of time. But then some students need a lot more attention than others. Some students, we just check in every week as normal. Some students, have to talk more frequently. Some students communicate a lot by email. Some students don't. And none of that is necessarily good or bad, but what you'd like to do as an applicant is figure out what is that person's mentoring style. Like if you think that you're going to need a lot of hands-on mentorship, and you might not even know that, right? So you can be kind of forgiving, but if you do need that, it will be very unfortunate if you're in a lab where the PI never responds to emails and is really hard to schedule a meeting with. And you can just ask the person straight up what their mentoring style is and ask them questions about how often you meet with students. You can talk to current and former students in those labs. You can get a sense of the lab even just by looking at how many people are in the lab. Because inevitably bigger labs, the PI is going to be stretched more. So you're not going to get as much one-on-one attention. And also, depending on whether the PI is an assistant professor or a tenured professor, whether they have, looking at their publication record, you can kind of get a sense of how risk averse or risk seeking they are, right? Like if you have a new PI who hasn't published that much in their main area of research, then it's a pretty reliable guess that they're going to look for students that are going to really help them push ahead their main line of research prior to tenure. So if you want to strike off in a new direction, that's probably not a good bet for you, right? So there's things like that. Try to think through how good a fit the PI would be for you personally.